Welcome everybody to the final installment for Milan Kundera's Identity, Part 4. One of the things I want to mention to you is I've put the final due date for all outstanding work, the final drop-dead date for the term as Wednesday, May 13th. That's in the email that I sent to you. But let's get straight to talking about this because we have a lot to talk about in this section. As you know by now, if you finish the book takes a dramatic turn somewhere in the book to be about something other than it was beforehand. Up to this point in time, we've really been talking about the book as a love story between Jean-Marc and Chantal. And somewhere in this fourth section, it turns into be a kind of crazy dream journey, perhaps, or perhaps it's just a fantastical space that we have entered into. But the author in section 50 puts it best when for the first time in the book he intrudes or she intrudes, can presume it's Kundera, and says, "And I asked myself who was dreaming. Who dreamed this story? Who imagined it? She, he, both of them, each one for the other? And starting when did their real life change into this treacherous fantasy?" That's a key question. When the train drove down under the channel, earlier, the morning she announced her departure for London, even earlier than that, the day in the graphologist's office, when she met the waiter from the cafe in the Normandy town. Or earlier still, when Jean-Marc sent her the first letter. But did he really send all those letters, or did he only imagine writing them? At what exact moment did the real turn into the unreal, reality into reverie? Where was the border? Where is the border? So in a nutshell, he's really kind of asking the question of, how our dreamed, our fantastical life comes to impact our everyday, normal, waking actions. And he sees these characters, really depicts them as characters who are informed by their subconscious, by their sense of projecting who they want to be on each other, etc., etc. Let's talk about the paper, because that's the real thing that we need to be thinking about here, might be struggling with. The paper essentially is a take on one of those last questions that we just read, okay? Namely the one where it says, at what exact moment did the real turn into the unreal, reality into reverie? Well, that's the question that we're going to kind of need to answer for this paper. It's the interpretation that we're placing on this book. And so the first thing I'd suggest for you to do is to make a timeline in the book and decide what section is real, what section is fantasy. Is there more than one fantasy section? If so, do you have a Chantal fantasy? Do you have a Jean-Marc fantasy? Do you have a series of fantasies interrupted by reality? And is there a dream section? Whose dream is it? Jean-Marc's, Chantal's? Or do you have some other state of mind that might be present here? Some people go to this place by talking about hypnosis or drug-induced states or some other altered state of consciousness. So you can really kind of go any way you want to, as long as the interpretation that you're placing on the book kind of makes sense. Okay? And then the paper will essentially be this. The intro, you can do whatever you want to introduce the particular subject or topic, maybe something about dreams, maybe something about the nature of reality, maybe the idea of fantasy and how we project ourselves in terms of our fantastical selves. But the thing that you need to do for the thesis is to essentially narrate the timeline that you put together here. All right? You'll see in this one, I basically have reality up until the sister-in-law scene, which we all discussed as before as being kind of a strange scene. That character just seems to come out of nowhere. Kind of like a dream, right? But then later on, when we get after, when we're in London and we get to that house where the orgy scene seems to be going on, that seems to be even more dreamlike than it is here at the sister-in-law scene. Things seem to still be, developing in according to some sense of reality or sensibility. Once we get to the house in London, all bets are off as to what's happening. All kinds of strange things are going on there. So I have reality up until the sister-in-law scene, and then it becomes Chantal's fantasy until the train goes into the channel, and that's when I've signaled that it switches to Chantal's dream. Okay, so that's your thesis, and then your body paragraphs are going to be dealing with each one of these sections, however many you have. I'd suggest keeping the number of sections in the book to a minimum. You don't want to do 5 or 6 because then it becomes a much more complicated thesis to write, as well as you'll have 5 or 6 different parts of your body to correspond to. The important thing is when you're doing those body paragraphs, the main thing you need to be showing is not what the character's state of mind is, not what the character's motivations are, but are you showing that indeed it is reality, it is fantasy, and it is dream. In doing that, you're going to have to probably think about, well, what distinguishes these states? How do I know what reality is, and how does it feel differently from fantasy? How does fantasy differ from dream? That's probably a tougher thing to draw a difference between. But I think you can start to do it just in terms of the way time and space are negotiated, in terms of the kinds of things that are happening, the strange appearances of things that come from out of nowhere, just like dreams do. In fantasies, they don't quite really work that way. Fantasies are more along the lines of, projected, maybe outsized desires coming into play, but they aren't, outside the boundaries of normal space and time. So, however you decide to determine between reality, fantasy, and dream, you have to make some distinction and analyze the events that are going on in that section in terms of one of those 3 things. Reality is in some respects the hardest because what do you say about something that's real? It feels real, people's intentions feel real. You often can get at this because you can talk about when you were reading it, you thought these characters were real up to a certain point in time. And then you started to suspect maybe at a certain juncture that they were kind of some strange, figment of somebody's imagination. And then certainly at some point in time, you've got it in your head, hey, something's strange here. This doesn't feel like reality at all. And for me, when I first read the book, that point that I got that sense was when Jean-Marc arrives at the train station at the same time Chantal does. And you're just like, well, how the heck did this happen? This is just too much of a coincidence whatsoever. So that's kind of where the straw that broke the camel's back occurred for me. And I could no longer suspend disbelief that I was in a space that was real anymore. That may have been a different place for you, right? Could have been all of those breakpoints that Kundera mentioned in that litany of different subjects or different spaces in the book. The graphologist's office. Before then was the letter writing, seeing maybe a break with reality into fantasy or dream. It's all up to you on how you want to interpret this book. One cautionary note, though. There's no right answer, and you can think this forever and ever and ever. You'll always find another place you can go further back and say, oh, well, it must have been here. One of the things I'm trying to get you to do for this particular paper is set your interpretation, your scheme, your plan for how you're going to proceed on this paper in stone, and then proceed from there and have faith, trust in the fact that you can build up your paper according to the scheme that you put in place, right? So it's really a kind of way to ensure that your outline for a paper then becomes the structure for the final draft. Okay, so sometimes don't overthink this because you're never going to come to the exact, conclusion. There'll always be another place that you could consider. But decide on something and move forward. And then finally in the conclusion, got a little bit rubbed off here, but is discuss what you think is the nature of the connection between reality, fantasy, and dream. That's what that's supposed to say down there. And, you know, what is Kundera trying to say about these things, all in all? He, I think, is trying to make a kind of equivalence between reality and fantasy and dream. But what is that equivalence, and how does it work? We don't have time to get into all of that. If we were in class, I would have, you know, a lot of things to say about how the idea of the dream being a kind of subconscious force impacts the way we think about ourselves and the way we project ourselves into the world. Much the way that Jean-Marc is projecting himself as this Cyrano de Bergerac character and trying to win the affection of Chantal. Chantal similarly is reflecting her projection back to him, and you get this kind of hall of mirrors between his projection bouncing off of her and her projection being thrown back on him. And this is an idea that you find a lot of times in a kind of unstable sense of identity that's at the root of a lot of postmodern thought. So you have that going on there as well. All of these seem to land into reality and have some impact on the way these people are reacting and acting in the world.